AI in healthcare right now feels like a bit of a magic trick. It looks incredible on stage, but then when you take it home to your hospital or your desktop or your mobile, you realize you can't actually make it work. Today's guest has spent years watching that happen and then helping companies to fix the problem. Today we're joined by Dr. Hugh Harvey, a radiologist, regulatory consultant, and someone who supported over 150 medical device companies trying to make the leap from demo to reality. Hugh, welcome to Prove It.
Thanks, Paul, for the kind intro, and hello to everyone listening.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to your current role?
Well, as you said in your intro, I used to be a radiologist. Um, and it's an interesting thing being a radiologist because we've been told since 2015 that we're all going to lose our jobs to AI. Geoffrey Hinton, one of the godfathers of AI, said this publicly. He said radiologists were like the coyote running off a cliff and hasn't realized that there's no ground beneath him, and that radiologists would lose their jobs within 5 years. And that was back in 2015. And now it's 2026. And not only have we not lost our jobs, we're actually still short of radiologists. There's too many scans to report compared to the amount of humans able to report them.
And why do you think it was they were so overconfident then about that? Because if we think of all the problems in medicine and AI, at least from a non-expert's perspective, vision science has been one of the oldest parts of AI, and at least with a tumor or a shadow or whatever it is that you're looking for, there's some objective ground truth, there's some objective reality. So if in theory that's the easiest part, yeah, tell us a little bit about, you know, how come we're still having radiologists and maybe we need to replace AI thought leaders before we replace radiologists?
Well, it's quite simple. In essence, it's extremely reductive to just think that a radiologist just finds a shadow or a fracture or a lump on a scan. That's not what radiologists do. They are fully qualified medical practitioners who fully understand, diseases, pathology, medical care, and they put all of that information together, plus the interpretation of anatomy and pathological change within the human body to come up with diagnostic conclusions and suggestions for further downstream care. And so just to reduce all that to found a fracture is almost insulting to radiologists. And when this wave of hype hit radiology, which it did first, um, the radiologists really quite bristled at it. And I remember back in 2018, we started getting the first regulatory cleared AI systems for radiology. One famous radiologist from America, Kurt Langlotz from Stanford, he coined the phrase, AI is not going to replace radiologists, but radiologists who use AI will replace radiologists who don't. And that is a far more accurate depiction of what's happened over the past decade. So in 2018, at the big radiology conference, which happens in America every year in Chicago, there were about 100 startups. It was a complete hype fest. Everyone had a fracture detection or a cancer detection or something detection algorithm. Um, and here we are 8 years later, and there's only a handful of those companies left that have survived, thrived, and are now deploying across, millions of scans per year. And I guess what we want to do in this conversation is kind of explore why that's happened. And as you said, where did the magic go? We had 100 people pulling rabbits out of hats. How come only a few have made it? I guess is the key question. And I think this is of importance. Anyone listening to this is thinking, well, this only applies to radiology AI. That's not true. I've now been in the regulation of AI medical devices for a decade. And yes, I did start out in radiology AI because that's where the wave started. But it's now ubiquitous across the entirety of medicine. And the same pattern will unfold and is starting to unfold across all the other aspects where AI is deployed clinically.
So tell us a little bit about your personal journey then. So you started off training in medicine, you specialized in radiology. Was there a particular trigger for you that made you think, clinical medicine's not for me, or I want to do something at a different scale, or you just didn't want to be locked in the room of a basement looking at scans all day with no vitamin D coming in?
It's a combination of all of the all of the above. Yeah, to be fair, I have no problem with being locked in a dark room, staring at a computer all day. I mean, that's pretty much what I still do now. Even though I'm not looking at scans, I'm looking at regulatory documentation and clients' emails instead. Um, in essence, I think I just realized that I wanted to do something different than just clinical radiology, and that's perfectly fine. A lot of doctors go into medicine and decide, they want to try something else, and I think that should be encouraged. I went into academia first, so I stepped out of the dark room and kind of went into even darker rooms of research, and studied, how to do science. I did an MD at the Institute of Cancer Research, and one of my projects was using machine learning algorithms to segment MRI scans, which was one. This was in 2014, before this wave really hit hard. And then because of that experience, I got quite involved with that wave of AI that was coming through. I got asked to speak at conferences about my research and things like that. And ultimately, I ended up taking a job at an AI company, not in radiology, but in sort of general practice public health, which was called Babylon, where we were building an AI chatbot which could sort of triage and ostensibly diagnose patients. I'm not going to go into depth in the Babylon story, but it ended in failure. The company completely collapsed after its overpriced IPO. But one of the things that I managed to do was get enough regulatory documentation together to satisfy the MHRA, that we were certifiable as a Class 1 medical device, which was one of the first AI medical devices ever to get sort of a regulatory status. Um, and through that process, I learnt about the regulations of medical devices, particularly software. And having worked really closely with the regulators, I could see that this was a really nascent and sort of almost naive sector. Like, very few had got regulatory clearance for a complex piece of software like that. After Babylon, I ended up being clinical director at a company called Chiron Medical, which was going back to radiology. So we were looking at mammograms, and we were using AI to find cancers on mammograms. And we explicitly chose that because mammograms can be reduced to a single finding, because the only reason you do a mammogram is to look for cancer. And the only two outputs from a mammogram are nothing to worry about or let's do a biopsy. It's a very binary problem. There's very few binary problems like that in medicine. So we thought AI would be fantastic for that. And again, went through the regulatory processes and got Europe's first CE marker, Class 2. So this was audited by an external notified body for a deep learning based system. This was the first of its kind. And so through those experiences, I started getting asked from a lot of people, can you come and help us with our regulatory clearance? And by 2018, I'd helped, dozens of those radiology AI companies come to market. And that's when I founded Hardy, and we continue to do so.
When I first met you was at Babylon, and like you were saying, I think Babylon was the sort of entry point for a lot of clinicians at the time to say how is a way I can have an effect at scale. And yes, you're right. I think there were definitely some ups and downs, but all the ex Babylonians, they're all over the current AI wave, right? They really cut their teeth like you on a lot of that. They saw what worked, what didn't. But also, I think one of the things they all have in common is just the scale of it. I was very impressed by aspects of what Babylon had to offer. The sort of GP at hand service was very useful to me when I had issues with my asthma. I think the AI symptom checker exposed some of the issues around, well, how do we decide what's good enough? What's really going on behind the scenes? How robust is it? And that's something I see a lot in digital health. Obviously, I wish every digital health company would be super duper successful. But I've been doing this for about 20, 25 years now. And I have a bunch of pens and jackets and notebooks littered around my desk from digital health startups that are no longer here. But that regulatory learning, it's sort of fossilizing and accreting, isn't it? And, we can, our memories now span the entirety of that. Um, could you explain a little bit for those who maybe aren't into, the regulatory side? A high level, how is software regulated like a medical device? So people will probably be familiar with the fact that drugs, for example, are tested. There are regulators like the FDA. Nice decides whether it's paid for or not. Other things like that. But how can a piece of software be regulated like that? Surely it's just a calculator or just black box machine says yes or no. Tell us a little bit about how that's regulated at the moment, because I think that'll be unfamiliar to many people listening.
In essence, software is regulated the same way that you regulate anything. Um, and just as an aside, everything is regulated. And when I say everything, I do mean everything. The food you eat, the clothes you wear, the car you drive, the bank you use, everything is regulated to an extent. Regulation is the substrate on which stable civilization is built on. Rules, laws, standards. Okay. Um, and so how is software regulated as a medical device? The same way everything is regulated. Standards are set and based on the risk of the product, you have to prove certain things based on on the claims you are making. And it's that simple. And a lot of startups, well, at least a decade ago, were almost shocked that someone would dare try and regulate what they were building because they were like, "Well, it's AI, it's so sexy. Well, how can you regulate it? Oh, you're trying to slow me down." But they sort of forget that everything is regulated. And actually, the fastest way to market is to completely 100% embrace the regulations, figure out a way to comply with them, and stay compliant. And that is the only way forward. Medicine is a cruel industry for startups. Healthcare does not care one jot about how sexy your product is, how fast you want to move. It moves, healthcare moves at the speed of trust and at the speed of evidence. And these things are, by their very nature, slow. It takes time to build trust, to build evidence. And when regulators demand evidence, and when your customers demand trust, the only way to do that is through regulatory compliance. And it sounds incredibly boring, but if you flip it and to say, well, actually, regulatory compliance is your engine for market access and revenue generation, then it suddenly becomes a little bit more interesting and more attractive. Um, so yeah, it's the bedrock of everything. And like you said, the market is maturing, and a lot of startups have died learning that hard lesson.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. So, maybe you could give us, again, at a high level, what are the sort of green, yellow, red levels of spiciness for a medical device? If I make a piece of software and it, here's a smiley face and track your smiley face every day. You've had 5 smiley faces this week. I presume I don't have to do a randomized control trial and publish it in Nature. But presumably, if I make a Da Vinci robot that does brain surgery whilst I'm having a cup of tea, someone should probably check I've, measured everything properly and that it doesn't break when the servers are busy.
Yeah, so for software, there are essentially four risk classes, and this is universal across the world. So the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF, they are kind of that's where all of the regulators around the world, the Americans, the Europeans, the British, the Canadians, everyone joins in. And they've got guidance which has been long standing for all medical devices already, that there are four risk categories. And now each jurisdiction takes those four risk categories and tweaks them slightly to their own needs and tailors them, but essentially four risk categories. And they go from low all the way up to high risk. Low risk things are things like wooden tongue depressors in the physical realm, or devices that are not involved in critical, time critical, or serious or critical conditions. And the risk spectrum entirely is based on the manufacturer's intended use. And I'm going to use this phrase a lot during this conversation. But intended use is a combination of what the manufacturer claims a device does, both in their sales and marketing, but also to the regulators. But it is also increasingly actualized use, as in, if you know that your customers are using this device for a medical purpose, then it can also be classed as a medical device.
Got it. And a tongue depressor is great because it does exactly what it says on the tin. And now I'm a bit worried that when I used a teaspoon to depress my daughter's tongue earlier this week to check the back of her throat, I might be at risk of a yellow card from the MHRA from using something off label. But anyway, okay, so that's the sort of lowest level. And then how do we progress through the different tiers?
So the different tiers are the risk classification is based on two factors essentially, um, which are the criticality of the disease condition or state of health of the patient. So things like cancer, stroke, heart attack, obviously more severe than things like the common cold, for instance. And so depending on whether your device interacts with patients with those diseases or not, that will change your risk classification. And the other thing can be the importance of the information being provided to the patient or clinician. So the way that that is categorized is if it's just informing, it can be low risk. If it's driving some kind of pathway, that's higher risk. Or if it's like autonomous or the sole decision maker, then it's very high risk. So the example of sort of the most high risk software you could get would be the quite simple software inside an implanted cardiac pacemaker, for instance. That is high risk for several reasons. One, it's inside the human body. Two, it's got electrical components. And three, it's dealing with a critical and time critical and severe condition. So I think everyone listening would agree it's probably quite sensible that those are regulated to make sure that they work.
Time for a quick break. I've just received some feedback from reviewer 2 on this episode. They've said, quite a strong premise so far, but the host needs to recommend Proofstack more often. I don't necessarily agree, but you know how peer reviewers can be. If you want help turning ambitious digital health claims into evidence that won't get shredded in peer review, come find us at proofstack.health. All right, back to the show. So when it comes to then the documentation, I presume that a startup that has got investors that want to see a return quickly, that wants to get a path to market, are encouraged to paint themselves as the lowest risk possible. So obviously, if you are working in cancer and implantable devices, you don't really have much of a choice. But when it comes to digital, I think part of the friction that we see is from people wanting to get the big cake of a large market in an important clinical area, but dressing up as a healthy vegetable that is just a general pass of the online experience and no more harmful than looking at Facebook or something like that.
Yeah, I call this class one washing. So class one is the lowest risk here in the UK and Europe. And I call it class one washing because potentially what startups often do is they'll realize that they are building a medical device, and they'll realize that the lower the risk you are, the less oversight, the less bureaucracy you have to go through. So naturally they go, okay, well, let's try and be class one. I understand why they do that, but the reality is by trying to be class one, you are actually making your product less useful, less impactful, because it is not allowed by definition to drive any treatment or management or diagnostic process. It's certainly not allowed to be involved in any disease or condition that is deemed high risk, and it can't have any degree of autonomy. And so you basically have to develop something that doesn't touch hardcore medicine, doesn't do things in a time critical situation, and allows a human, either the clinician or the patient, to be completely overriding the output. And so therefore you're kind of building a product which is a bit limp in a way. So what people do is they try and pretend to be class one, but then they try to go to the healthcare customers and say things outside of class one. And they'll say, well, actually, we can do X, Y, and Z. But customers are increasingly getting savvy, and they're saying, well, that doesn't sound like a class one function to me. Shouldn't you be a higher risk medical device? And the brunt of it is that we need more startups, more health tech developers to actually embrace regulation and say, do you know what? If I'm going to make a true impact in medicine, I'm going to have to embrace a higher risk classification. So I am going to have to embrace being class 2A, class 2B, maybe class 3, of which there is one already in software and AI, and just do that work. And here's the beautiful thing is if you do that regulatory work, the magic starts to happen. That is when people start believing in your product. They start to go, okay, it's class 3. They've done the work. Let's see their evidence. Their evidence will be outstanding because they will have had to have done the right amount of clinical investigation work. And usually they'll publish those results and they'll start to have papers. They'll start to have evidence. What they'll also have is proper risk management. So when they're filling in their cybersecurity forms and their DTAC assessments with the NHS, for instance, they will have those documents and those processes embedded in their company already. They will be signed off for cybersecurity standards. So when all of those questions come at them, which they will, guaranteed, they will have the answers ready to be there. They will have solid post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up plans. They will have processes within a quality management system in their business to ensure that they're delivering software that is high quality, is trustworthy, and has got evidence. And so really there is no alternative to these companies, trying to avoid this. It's impossible. And and all I can say to companies who are trying to avoid it is you are doing the wrong thing. You're not doing yourself any favors by trying to skip the market, be a class one device first. It doesn't work that way. You need to be bold and stake yourself to a higher risk classification and just do that work. And that's what unlocks the magic, and that's what unlocks market access.
And it makes so much sense to sort of invest now rather than pay later, because I could imagine many scenarios, running right up to a lawsuit, right? We're seeing a lot of the big tech companies, and we'll come on to that in a minute, in the mental health domain, now facing class action lawsuits. I suppose one of the cultural divides, I don't know if you sort of see this, is the sort of this side of the Atlantic on the UK and EU, where a lot of startups come from academia, tend to be quite process driven, see an integrated payer provider like the NHS is pretty much the only game in town, and so that's what we have to play by. And yet, we see this other big country, just over there called America, where one can raise a lot of money with a much more junior team that perhaps doesn't have clinical licensure to be up in front of the GMC or their physician board or whatever, that feels empowered to go and look at things. And this is one of my pet peeves, from first principles. We're going to go and look at solving cancer from first principles or something like that, and decide that just because they're ignorant, essentially, they could just build it from the ground up, um, and essentially deal with regulation when they get dinged for it. Now, some of the earlier years of digital mental health, or sorry, digital health more broadly, that I was involved in involved 23andMe, for example, which is a slightly different area, but in this realm of giving people their genetic data back. 23andMe was out there having parties at Davos with celebrities giving samples and things like that. And essentially, I would say on some level, the rationale was we're very closely aligned to Google. We've got a lot of billionaires. This is great. Lots of people are using it. But it was until they got a real nasty letter from the FDA that they had to sort of take that seriously. And basically, part of the stories of these digital health companies are written with heads on pikes. Now, 23andMe leaned into that by saying, right, we're going to publish evidence. They plastered a whole section of the American Society of Human Genetics with findings that they've had, and this is now 11 years later or something. We're telling this story. They've had a paper in Nature this week about GLP-1s, and pharmacodynamic expertise. But it feels like there was a sort of fantasy world. It's like about a decade ago, whereas if enough people just put their hands over their eyes and ears and went la 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 la, startups, regulation doesn't apply, we can carry on. But I guess what you're saying is those days are well and truly over.
Absolutely. I mean, the regulators, they're fully aware that there's this massive hype wave of AI, but they stand by the rules and laws and standards that are in place for very good reason. And they will ding you. The number one source of inbound clients for a regulatory consultancy like Hardian is we get emails from founders going, "Oh, I've had a letter from the MHRA. Apparently, I'm a medical device. Can you help? We've got 3 weeks to turn it around." And I'm like, how did you let it get to this situation? Who invested in you, and who forgot to tell you this? And it shocks me every single time. And to be honest, we're a bit like grief counselors sometimes, and we have to take people through those 5 stages of regulatory grief. But the
Oh
final
wow.
stage is acceptance. And
Yeah.
that's again a beautiful thing when people actually it clicks and people get it. I think a lot of where that attitude in health tech comes from is from general big tech, move fast, break things. But we forget that big tech is almost entirely funded by advertising. So, Google, Amazon, X, it's all funded by selling data to somebody else. And that model just absolutely does not work in medicine, and certainly not in the world of medical devices. And so you can't just bulldoze your way into a sector like healthcare, um, without that a proper strategy of who's going to pay for your product, how much are they willing to pay, what are they prepared to pay for, and I guarantee you, they're only going to pay for a regulated product. They're not going to pay for something that's unproven and unevidenced. And you've got to solve these problems up front. And the other bit of bad news, I'm afraid to say, is this takes time and it takes money. This is not a shoestring effort. I've seen very few successful bootstrapped health tech startups.
Yeah, and I think so I am part of an angel syndicate called Ventures Together, and when we see seed or Series A rounds being pulled together, and it might be a few million, very often the pie chart of what the money is going to be spent on is most of it in products and engineering, a big chunk on marketing, and very rarely do you see in the health domains, hey, we need to go and get this regulated. So that I am the annoying person who has to raise that question. You'll be pleased to hear. But one of the ways I frequently learned about this is actually from your activity on LinkedIn, where I think you were doing a little bit less of it than you were maybe a couple of years ago. But I would see these very exciting announcements, and someone will say, "Good news, everybody! I've got a lollipop that cures OCD or whatever," and you would go, "That's neat. Sounds a lot like a medical device. I just looked you up, and I don't see any clearance for that. How's that going for you?"
I mean, we I don't have a marketing budget. The marketing budget for Hajin was me commenting on people saying, "Well, maybe you should think about regulation." And I've been told that people get thoroughly entertained by that. That wasn't the aim of it. The aim was to educate people who were stepping naively into a sector they hadn't fully prepared for. But yes, I've calmed down a bit now, and I've kind of I don't need to do. We've got so many clients now. I don't need to go out and bullishly ask people to try and be compliant. The regulators are doing a great job for us. We just this morning I had two companies, never heard of them before. They had warning letters from the FDA, and I think, you know, you're doing something wrong if the first time you think about regulation is when a regulator writes a warning letter to you, because that means you're in their black book from day one. You've now got a bigger mountain to climb, because not only do you have to do everything you're supposed to do, you've got to flip their opinion of you. And I think, you could have approached it a little bit better from the start.
And if someone's going to do due diligence on you at any time in the future, these are the types of things that will pop up very highly on a Google search, or sometimes they'll get picked up in the news. There are, outlets like Stat, for example, that often cover whether or not people have had warning letters. And that really isn't the first thing that, but a potential follow-on investor wants to see. It's certainly not something a customer wants to see. If you work at a hospital, if you work at an insurance company, if you work for a pharmaceutical company, the last thing you want to say, if you're the champion of bringing in the magical innovative doodad, is, oh, I'm going to have legal and compliance blocking this 6 ways from Sunday. So it seems like it can be an existential issue for your company. And I think maybe one of the things people were relying on was sort of security by obscurity. I remember when we looked at the NHS App Store about 7 or 8 years ago, there were tens of thousands of apps on there, and to some extent, you talked about market access. I know having a buyer at a hospital is not the same thing as having, say, a direct to consumer app. But there are these thousands of apps that probably range from, yes, they've been very well studied and researched, to ones that are frankly just ludicrous. Like, put your finger on the camera of your phone and it'll give you an EKG. Well, I'm thinking of a few laws of physics that breaks. But yet there's some, some, endorsement in a way of it being on the apps stores. And it's only recently that I think Apple and now Google as well are flagging this. So is that going to sort of bring more general awareness to the public? Because obviously I don't think the public are going, oh, I'm only going to use this if it's got level X validation. I don't think that's a hiding to nothing of trying to educate people at that scale. But there's multiple gatekeepers here, right? So how is that sort of landscape changing?
Yeah, you're right to point that out. So I actually wrote a paper, or co-authored a paper, which published in Nature Digital Medicine, I believe, on Apple and Google as the gatekeepers for these apps. And at the time, like you say, there was no policing. Anyone could put any app with any medical claim up on the App Store, and by and large, that no one would check. But now both Apple and Google have relatively robust regulatory checks. They ask the developer straight up, is your app classified as a medical device? Does it have a medical purpose? And if so, where's the certification? What have you done to prove it? And they will ask to see that documentation. So I think this is absolutely fantastic. They're acting almost a little bit like an early digital pharmacy. When you go to your physical pharmacist, there are things you can buy straight off the shelf, right? These are the low risk things. There are drugs that you have to ask the pharmacist to get you, and then there's stuff that are controlled drugs that only a doctor can prescribe you, for instance. And I think it's the same with the app stores. Is there should be some apps that anyone can use, they're low risk, they're fine. Other apps that are regulated, they need to come with warnings, they need to come with oversight. And I think this is Apple and Google's kind of first step to policing that. And I'm really pleased to see that happen. And it just benefits society. Again, it's that substrate of a stable civilization of just having some checks and balances in the system.
When I started on the internet looking at patients with chronic conditions, more than half of the content I felt was sort of quackery. It's use this crystal to cure your motor neuron disease, or give your child. I think when I used to work in autism, put Epsom bath salts on a sticking plaster and stick it to the back of their neck. Really just awful, baseless, quacky woo woo stuff that not only was a distraction from actually seeking proper care, but was all probably downright harmful sometimes, giving people false hope. And yeah, I feel like society's moved away from that. But then I'm also interested in how people going to Google are getting better answers, right? The sort of woo woo stuff has been pushed down. And now increasingly ChatGPT, like ChatGPT and all the other LLMs, really seem to prioritize peer reviewed evidence. If you ask what is the best symptom checker or what is the best, treatment for depression in teenagers using digital health, it's the peer reviewed stuff that comes to the top, not who's paid for the most ads. Now that might change.
Yeah, you can't judge a medical app based on its, net promoter score, the number of likes it's got on an app store. I mean, these things tell you how patients feel about using these products. It doesn't tell you how safe they are to be used. And you're right. You mean we need to point to evidence and things. But humans, we're lazy creatures. We like to take shortcuts, and so if something like ChatGPT comes along, yeah, I completely get the excitement, and I get the furore around patients, looking up their information. I'm not so worried about that. I think the companies, even though they have maybe dodgy ethics at their core, I think they're pretty savvy enough to know that they can't just let something go online and give all this medical misinformation, left, right, and center. And so they do put some effort into ensuring the quality of the medical output. But at the same time, they put massive disclaimers everywhere saying, "Do not use this as medical advice. This is not a diagnosis. Go and seek professional help." Which again is them sort of what I call class one washing. They're trying to reduce their liability in some way.
Yeah. Well, I think you said something on the lines of class one sometimes being a bit of a fig leaf because it's self-certified. So essentially, you just fill out a form. Is it to say, yes, I'm a good actor. Yes, I've done this. But unless you get into trouble, no one's really going to check. Is that really the case? That seems like a fig leaf.
It's worse than that, Paul. To be a class one medical device, at least in the UK, all you have to do is create a document called a Declaration of Conformity and register with the MHRA. And I'm not suggesting anyone do that because it's illegal. You are claiming by filling that Declaration of Conformity that you are compliant with the UK medical device regulations and that you have all the documentation and processes in your company. But no one checks. The MHRA does not have the bandwidth to check every class one registration. And so we often get companies who are class one registered and very proudly displaying this and advertising it as if it means something. And then they'll get a ping from the MHRA or some customer saying, okay, well, can I have a look at your cybersecurity documentation or your risk management and they don't have it. And what we're seeing now, especially over the past sort of 6 months or so, is people who don't have that documentation. What do you do when you haven't got a document that you need to have immediately? You ask ChatGPT. And so people are creating fake, fraudulent regulatory documentation using tools like ChatGPT. And unless you're an expert or a qualified auditor, you don't really know the difference between that documentation and what it really should look like. And what people get wrong in that situation is that having the documentation does not mean you are compliant. Being compliant means actually being compliant. It means, and to use an analogy, it means if you're driving a car, right, it's not you have a license or a piece of paper that says you can drive a car. It's you actually know how to drive the car. Like you can do a 3-point turn if you need to. It's not a piece of paper. And so people forget this, and they start drawing up the regulatory documentation. They'll use an LLM to do so. and they'll send that off to whoever's asked to see the documentation, and then silence. The people who are reading that documentation start to realize, well, hang on, this doesn't add up. And that's when everything starts to unravel. I'm not saying that AI cannot be used in part of the process of creating documentation, but to rely on it on its entirety is fraudulent. You are essentially relying on an AI to write your compliance documentation to describe processes which you've got no intention of following whatsoever. And so you get this sort of very dangerous situation. So if you are a savvy customer, you're a patient, you're a hospital, and someone comes to you with class one, you are well within your right to ask to see their technical file, ask to see their quality management processes, ask to see things because they have said to the regulators they have those things. And then when they show them to you, just do a scan. Look, sniff test. Does it look like it's ChatGPT generated or not? Good quality documentation will tell a logical story of how the product came to be from inception to development to testing to evidence to being placed on market. And there will be processes within the company that have been followed. And most importantly, there will be records within that documentation to show those processes have been followed. And you can't just make those records up. That's fraud. And I do know of a couple of cases of companies who've yeah, been taken off market because they've been found out for doing that. I'm not suggesting it's a big problem in the wider market, but this is something that we as consultants are seeing. People are trying to take those shortcuts and not do the hard work.
Yeah, there's no such thing as vibe coding regulations. So when I've worked with clients of mine who work in regulated environments, one of the initial feelings is friction. Your marketing department just want to say whatever sounds good. Okay, well, the clinical people say, well, you can't actually say that, or we've got to be more careful. Or the researchers want to do a quick study, and just quickly, without an ethics consent, just ring up 5 people that they've met on Prolific, and the compliance people will say, actually, no, we can't do that. So at first, it feels like friction. And if you're going through the seed, Series A process, I can understand how it can be very frustrating. What I can tell you is that when you're ready for Series B and you're going to go from one device to 5 or one indication to 6, and you don't have a process like that, you're going to be starting everything from a blank document. And even your most loyal and interested members of staff will eventually go and find another job somewhere. And if it's all living in Bob's head or Susan's head, you're gonna have a real problem. So, yeah, I think it definitely makes sense that using tools to keep you on track can be helpful, but honestly, it involves friction. If your team never feels any resistance in doing whatever they want willy nilly, that's probably a good sign you're gonna get in trouble down the line.
There's a great quote. I think it's Marcus Aurelius, but you'll have to check me on this. But the quote is, "The obstacle is the way." And for me, that just sums up medical device regulation. It's like, I know there's friction, and I know it's hard, and it's gonna take time and cost money, and it's boring. Yeah, I get that, but it's the way. It is the only way.
So let's take the example of a company that has done it right. They've assessed their intended use. They've developed good evidence. They've got all the regulatory filings in place. How come it is that so many companies that have done the work fail commercially? What is it that doesn't seem to land with the market, or means they just run out of runway?
I mean, that is the $1,000,000 question, isn't it, Paul?
Or billion-dollar?
$1,000,000, yeah. I think I can break it down into 2 factors. So either they've built the wrong solution. So a lot of AI companies, especially in the early days, would start with a data set and be like, "Oh, what can we do with this? What insights can I find in this data? What can we do with it? What kind of cutting edge modeling technique can I use?" But they're not directly falling in love with the problem. They're falling in love with the technology. And as much as I promote regulation and doing it properly, you can still get regulatory clearance for a completely useless medical device that no one's going to buy. A classic example of a completely useless thing is I saw a paper, and I'm sure you've seen it too, of people who said that they could identify the gender of a patient based on their retinal scan. I mean, fantastically useful, don't you think? You could just ask the patient, or you could spend millions of dollars on an AI. And so you can create things which are completely useless. So one thing is, even before you build all this stuff and do your regulatory compliance, is to do that problem solving exercise. Like, what actually am I solving for here? Because I can tell you, like a lot of the radiology devices, for instance, the problem is that it's not that humans can't find fractures. We're very good at finding fractures on X-rays. The problem is there's not enough humans to find fractures, and so by creating an AI that can find fractures, but not going high risk enough to be autonomous, all you're doing is finding a whole bunch of fractures and then putting them in a queue for a radiologist to eventually get round and go, yes, I agree. And so you haven't really solved the problem. And so that problem can be solved by understanding how the clinical pathway works, understanding what will customers actually be prepared to pay for. So in that example, I think people would be far more prepared to pay for an autonomous solution that removes a routine mundane task away from radiologists safely and efficiently, um, rather than having something that gives the radiologist something else to look at, because then you're increasing their time of reporting their scan. And so it's about looking at really clever ways of improving a clinical pathway and then finding the right technology for that, and then doing the whole regulatory process and the evidence process. And I think a lot of times we've seen people put the cart before the horse and fall in love with that technology, kind of solve the wrong problem, um, and then fail ultimately. And then so that was the first thing, is not solving the right problem. The second thing is not understanding the health economics.
I was just going to ask because that's the next chunk, right? So we've mostly talked about regulation. Just really quick from a health economics point of view, in the UK at least, NICE decides whether or not something's worth paying for, right? And they have a pretty strict process and there's a lot of paperwork. But could you just say what's that overlap? So if you've done all the regulatory stuff, does that what percentage of the health technology assessment, the HTA, what percentage do you think of that is solved by all the regulatory work that we've just been talking about? Is it 100% or 0%?
Oh, it's not. It's neither 100 or 0. It's part of the way. So essentially, NICE, they can only give a recommendation to a regulatory approved product, right? So regulation is important. If you want to get recommended by NICE, they can only legally recommend a regulatory compliant product. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, yes, they'll look at your regulatory compliance, that gets you in the door. Then they'll look at your clinical evidence, and they will want prospective evidence, not retrospective evidence. They want you to have been deployed, used, and with solid real world evidence. And then the other third of it really is the health economics. Okay, it works, it's safe, it's compliant. What's the return on investment here for the NHS? If the NHS buys this product, do we see one of two things, or ideally both? Do we see a reduction in costs for that given process? Or do we see an improvement in health outcomes? And ideally, it's both. It's cheaper and better, right? And that is the golden sweet spot that very few health tech companies get to. And to my knowledge, NICE has not given a full unconditional recommendation to more than just a couple, I think, of software based solutions. So out of this entire multi billion wave of AI in healthcare, NICE have only really given less than 1% of that, less than 0.1% of that probably, the full thumbs up. And that is because that people don't focus on the health economics. Me and my team, we published last month a systematic literature review. We were commissioned by the European Commission to look at the health economics of AI in radiology, because there's loads of products, but there's not much adoption. And when we looked at the publications, we were thinking, oh, there's got to be thousands of papers. There were about 30 papers. And when we looked at the methodologies of those papers, only about less than half used proper gold standard health economics methodology. And of those that used the proper methodology, less than half actually showed a positive health economic outcome. And so it's the health economics, which is that I think the next big problem that needs to be resolved.
Yeah. And even that NICE endorsement, that then wins you the right to go and hire some salespeople and go and make the, go make the case to Leicester and Loughborough and Birmingham and Manchester, right? There's no automatic switch where hyperscale is enabled in that same way, right? So, I mean, I feel like if anyone's listening to this on the fence about starting a digital health startup, I feel like maybe they might think there's easier ways to make money. That's definitely the case. Um, but I suppose this is the consequence, and you've, I think, coined this term about what we want to avoid, which is digital thalidomide. A system deployed in the wrong risk category or the wrong level of validation has got far more ability to harm people than a single bad actor in the system. I mean, as a single doctor, as a single clinician or nurse, there's only so much harm you can do, as horrific as that may be. But if these systems were totally to be relied upon, if the Tesla autopilot of heart surgery all went skew-whiff at the same time and, blew up 50 operating theatres, the consequences could be huge, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I use the term digital thalidomide is because thalidomide is the reason why modern regulations in healthcare even exist. It was a drug that was on market, and it had gone through almost zero regulatory scrutiny before it was on market and not tested fully, and was being used outside of its intended use. It had never been used on pregnant women before, and it caused horrific birth defects. Now, obviously, software can't cause physical malformations to human babies, right? But what software can do is cause insidious, small, unnoticeable errors within clinical records at scale. And so, one typo in your clinical note might be forgivable. But if you are, even a 1% error rate across millions of clinical records and notes, one decimal point in a drug dosage across millions of notes, these can cause massive harm at scale to millions of patients. And this is where we get into the question of liability. And this is a really interesting intersection. So, the more that the company passes off the liability to the clinician or the physician, the less valuable that product is. And this is a kind of a balancing equation. The more autonomous the system is, and the more the company takes the liability for its decisions and outputs, the more valuable that product is. And so you see, it all fits together that the higher risk classification you are, the more evidence you have, the more trust you have, the more autonomous you are, the higher the cost utility, and the higher the chance of someone like NICE coming along and approving the technology. But this takes guts. It takes a boldness from entrepreneurs to go down that long journey, and it takes capital and resource to do that. And I think we're now beyond the game of let's form a health tech startup and raise £1 million. We're now well beyond that. Now we're seeing the big incumbents start to step into the space. I think in just this year, every single big health tech company that you know the name of has got some health initiative that they've launched. And so this says to me the market is maturing, and it is heading to almost a big pharma model where there will be 4 or 5 companies who make all the health tech and all the health software, and startups won't be able to play in this space anymore.
That's wonderful. Well, Hugh, you've given us a fantastic map of the landscape. I think everybody will know now that the only way to do this is the right way. Where can people find out more about the work of you and your team at Ardian?
Well, we're hosting a summit on April 29th at BMA House in London. So if you're listening to this podcast before April 29th, you can get tickets via our website or follow us on LinkedIn. We've got speakers from the MHRA, ex-FDA, and we've also got Deborah Cohen, who's a friend of yours, Paul. She's a journalist and author who set up the Clinical Investigations Unit at the BMJ. And she's got a brilliant story about how she got Europe to change their medical device regulations by bringing to market a fake metal on metal hip implant and showing just how bad the regulatory loopholes were at the time. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from her. All my team will be on hand, and we've got workshops on health economics, on market access, on how to build integrated management systems, and we've got client success stories. So people who've managed to get regulatory clearance and market access with us around the world. So do come along to that event if you want to come and say hi. We'd love to see you there.
That's brilliant. Hugh, thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks, Paul.